two villages where there's been extreme frontline fighting over the past several weeks, Robotyne and Verbove. That is a significant development because it shows that the Ukrainians have successfully degraded the Russian positions around the Dragon's Teeth and the ditch in that area, and that they're now able to maneuver vehicles further into the Russian controlled areas. The Russians do not have sufficient manpower to man all the trenches they've dug. Many of those trenches, they are designed that the Russians can simply fall back onto them or they can be backfilled, but they're not all filled. And what we've seen so far is the Ukrainians degrading elements of three major Russian formations, a combined arms army and two airborne divisions in this area of the front, really within the first 5 to 10 kilometers of their defense in depth. So it seems that if the Ukrainians are successful in breaking those Russian forces at this position in the front line, they might be able to get past the most heavily mined areas, the worst field fortifications, the bulk of where the Russian massive combat power is, and the territory behind that should be relatively smoother sailing.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, which has become a leading authority on the war in Ukraine. George is the Geospatial Intelligence Team lead and is a senior analyst on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio. George, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time today. I really want to get an idea of how you track the war in Ukraine and the workings of the Institute for the Study of War in a moment. But can I, first of all, just get your reaction to some news, a recent development. The Polish Prime Minister has said regarding the supply of weapons to Ukraine that we are no longer transferring any weapons. We will now arm ourselves with the most modern weapons. This is part of a dispute over Poland's grain import ban on Ukraine. What's your reaction to that?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me, Kate. The Poland's recent decision is actually, when you want to look to Warsaw, you have to look to Moscow. This is actually a desired effect of the Russians' campaign that they've been conducting to strike Ukraine's grain infrastructure and shipping port infrastructure. The Russian sustained campaign against that infrastructure has forced Ukraine to take its grain and take it to the hungry world through land shipping routes, which includes Poland and Eastern Europe. And of course, there are farmers in those countries with their own domestic production, and they see that it's dumping. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians still need to export that grain, and the Poles have retaliated by now essentially saying we are going to be cutting off the weapon supplies. This is exactly a desired effect of the Russian campaign. It is not a secondary effect. The Russian strategy of victory, because they know they cannot defeat the Ukrainians on the battlefield, that they actually, with sustained Western support, they have to erode that support.
Are you suggesting then that Russia has actually influenced Poland on this?
So the Russians have within their own doctrine this system called reflexive control. And the concept of reflexive control is that you can actually influence the stimuli of different actors if you understand how they work, you understand their cognitive biases. And if you can poke them and goad them in a certain way, you can get them to react in a predictable way. And I think the Russians understand that if the Ukrainians essentially engage in grain dumping, that's going to upset Polish farmers, and that's going to have major political consequences for the Polish government. So I think the Russians know about that dynamic and have exploited it.
Poland is Ukraine's fifth biggest military supporter, but is far behind the US. What impact do you think this will have? I know that some authorities in Poland are trying to play down how long this is actually going to last, but what impact do you think it might have?
I don't want to speculate too long because no one really knows, but it's my hope that it'll be a temporary effect. As we know, Polish parliamentary elections are coming up just around the corner in October. And, a lot of conservatives, particularly farmers in Poland, are the ones that have been impacted the most by the grain shipments through Eastern Europe as opposed through the Black Sea. So hopefully once the Poles are able to get across their upcoming elections, they'll be able to resume supporting Ukraine militarily.
We also know Poland has had a very important role as a NATO jump-off point and for servicing and repairing Ukrainian equipment. Could this dispute escalate, do you think, and harm NATO's support operation?
As far as I can tell, I don't think so. I think most of the Polish rhetoric has been exclusively about Poland sending its own weapon stores to Ukraine specifically. They've made no indication that Poland intends to revoke the use of its territory for larger support operations. And I'm not particularly concerned about that at this time.
And Poland has reduced its own military by a third to send equipment to Ukraine and is now building back up with Western weapons. Can Ukraine and its Western allies make enough weapons to fight this war and continue doing so for the length which we anticipate is going to be needed?
That's the $1 million question. I frequently get asked, how long is the war going to end? Can we all go back to normal in this, by this time in 18 months or 2 years? And the fact of the matter is that you have to fight the war that you're given, that your adversary brings to you, not that the war that you want to fight. And I think you guys across the pond in the UK, from your experience of World War II, you understand that well. The Western industrial base fundamentally, has not been prepared to sustain the kind of intense war that currently is being waged in Ukraine. And I think it's been a wake-up call for many Western states, their defense industrial bases, and we've been catching up ever since. I do think that the collective West does have the capacity to be able to support the war if we make the necessary political decisions. And that's why I think the political decision-making space in Brussels and London and Washington, Paris and Berlin are actually the decisive battlegrounds for this war.
What do you mean, what necessary political decisions?
The necessary political decisions being, will the Western coalition continue to support Ukraine for 2 years, for 5 years, for a decade if necessary? Will we continue to supply them not only with cutting edge weapon systems like big ticket items like HIMARS and ATACMS or Storm Shadows and F-16s, but sustain it in mass? The U.S. government, has pledged to send about a company of Abrams tanks, which is great, but it's a very small number, and that very small quantity of tanks that will be sent is not going to be fundamentally game changing. The UK has sent a squadron, 14 Challenger tanks. That's an excellent policy decision, but in the long scheme of the war, the quantity of tanks has to be much larger than 14. It has to be a much higher order, especially as those tanks naturally, they will participate in combat operations. They will be degraded. They will be destroyed. And the question is, do we sort of say, well, we've done our bit, we've sent our 14 tanks, or are we going to continue to sustain that over the long run?
Can we talk a little bit more about the counteroffensive on the ground? What are the most significant frontline developments you can tell us about?
Yeah, the big piece of news that's going around right now, which is quite tactically significant, is we've now, as of last night, for the first time, have confirmed footage that show that the Ukrainians have been able to take heavy mechanized infantry fighting equipment beyond the first two major Russian defensive field fortification layers. They've been able to take U.S. provided Stryker infantry fighting vehicles and German Marder vehicles and take them past the big continuous line of the anti-vehicle tank ditch, and then take that past another line, which is the line of Dragon's Teeth. That footage, it was posted yesterday. It could have come from an earlier date, perhaps earlier in the week, but that's a significant achievement.
And where exactly is that, George?
This is in Robotyne, in Zaporizhia Oblast, between two villages where there's been extreme frontline fighting over the past several weeks, Robotyne and Verbove. That is a significant development because it shows that the Ukrainians have successfully degraded the Russian positions around the Dragon's Teeth and the ditch in that area, and that they're now able to maneuver vehicles further into the Russian controlled areas.
Do you have an idea of how sizable that advance is?
Based on where the Ukrainians started when this counteroffensive began on June 4, based on where the Strykers and Marauder vehicles were located yesterday, that's a penetration of about 6.5 kilometers, give or take. So it's not bad, but they've been fighting there, and the Ukraine furthest extent of their observed troops that we've seen is a little bit further than that as well. But the Ukrainians, they've been widening this breach. They've now introduced armored vehicles behind some very, very tough field fortifications. And it bodes quite well as the Ukrainians are continuing to try to likely attempt another go at a large breakthrough. I'd also like to add that I know that the general size of the blue that's appeared on the maps of the last 3 months has been relatively small. And some
Mm,
onlookers have observed that and perhaps thought maybe the Ukrainian counteroffensive isn't going so well. And while it's true that the counteroffensive has not been going as well as we would have hoped, or I think as many NATO planners assumed, the Ukrainians are still making decent progress. And I want to be
mm.
very clear, territory gained on the map is not the best metric for determining the progress or the success or the failure for any given military operation. The Ukrainians have been putting in tremendous work in degrading a lot of Russian combat power in this sector of the front line and also in Bakhmut in the east. And the degradation of that combat power, even if it doesn't change controlled terrain a lot, is quite significant and can set conditions for more large territorial changes in the future.
Also playing into that is how close, and with bringing the M14 supply route for Russian forces into range of the Ukrainians, how close and how much further do the forces need to get before they can actually cut those supplies off?
So that question depends entirely on at what point do you seek to interdict it? Because the M14 does not run entirely parallel to the Ukrainian front line. There are some locations where they can interdict it from a closer range. There's places where they can interdict it from a further range. There's a series of debates about how close do they have to get before, do they even have to physically stand on top of it? Can they get close enough that they could bring their artillery systems and their indirect fire to strike it and effectively deny its use by Russian forces if they get close enough? So it depends. I think if you were to take the easiest path and say, from just pure geometry in terms of where the Ukrainian frontline trace is now to where that Russian highway is now, I'll calculate it again on the fly. That distance is about, this is if they go from where they are now near Robotyne to Melitopol, that's about 70 kilometers worth of distance. But again, that number doesn't, I have to be very clear about that number. The Russians don't have defense in depth that deep. The defense in depth area that the Russians have from where the Ukrainians are now is only about 20, 25 more kilometers. Beyond that, it's not developed. And even within that 20-kilometer defense in depth, the Russians do not have sufficient manpower to man all the trenches they've dug. Many of those trenches, they are designed that the Russians can simply fall back onto them or they can be backfilled, but they're not all filled. And what we've seen so far is the Ukrainians degrading elements of 3 major Russian formations, a combined arms army and 2 airborne divisions in this area of the front, really within the first 5 to 10 kilometers of their defense in depth. So it seems that if the Ukrainians are successful in breaking those Russian forces at this position in the front line, they might be able to get past the most heavily mined areas, the worst field fortifications, the bulk of where the Russian massive combat power is, and the territory behind that should be relatively smoother sailing.
And I know that you have access to Telegram bloggers, and that's part of your information gathering. Are you able to access comms to get an assessment of the state of the morale and supplies of the forces of each side? I mean, it's hard to generalize, I suppose, but can you get a general impression?
Yes, it is possible to get vignettes into various different units' morale. Morale is tricky to calculate because, you know, morale can differ very, very much for different individuals and also for different units. A Russian unit that's getting smashed really hard in the frontline meat grinder south of Robotyne and Verbove and Zaporizhia, their morale is quite low, and you can see that they'll give interviews, they'll make appeals to commanders, sort of these video essays that they'll then post on their Telegram channels where they talk about the problems they have. There was one unit yesterday who put out an appeal talking about how the ammunition they're receiving from the Russians is not exploding when it makes contact with the earth, or sometimes it doesn't fire properly. They were complaining about the quality of their munitions. Ukrainians post similar videos like that as well. Conversely, if you go to look at other places on the theater where there isn't as much intense fighting, like say in southwestern Ukraine and Kherson, the Russians there have not generated those sort of videos where they complain about horrific horrific conditions or horrific standards, and therefore, we have no indication into how those troops are feeling in general. But there is a mood, and what's interesting about the Telegram blogosphere is that a lot of these big profile accounts, they don't simply speak into the echo chamber and sort of say, here's what we're feeling. They all interact with each other. They're interconnected. They repost each other. They have dialogues with each other. And if you study systematically find a way to study the larger discourse between various different Kremlin military bloggers and military leaders and units, you can actually sort of weave together a picture of what the general state of the Russian morale is.
And what is it?
I think right now they're concerned. There was a lot of premature Russian celebration in June and July about how they had successfully defeated the Ukrainian counteroffensive and that it was all over. But now I think they're quite concerned. The Russians have had to redeploy at least elements of 2 different divisions, airborne divisions, from across the theater. They had to rob Peter to pay Paul to reinforce the south. They pulled the 7th Airborne Division from from Kherson, and they pulled elements of the 76th Division from Luhansk. And those units have been brought in. They've now been committed to combat because the initial army, the 58th Combined Arms Army that was fighting in this area, has been degraded. And of course, over the last week, the Ukrainians managed to capture 2 villages south of Bakhmut. And the Russians have acknowledged that loss on their sides. They don't deny it. I think they're concerned about it. And I think the Russians are hoping that they'll be able to stymie this Ukrainian progress before winter. And I think they're banking on Western coalition and political support for Ukraine to collapse before their own lines do.
Let's just talk a little bit more about what you do at the Institute for the Study of War. First of all, how did it all start and what do you aim to do exactly?
Sure. Our mission at the Institute for the Study of War is to essentially help policymakers and the media and your average citizen become more informed about important military matters that affect American interests and the interest of America's allies. We're a think tank, but we differ from your Council on Foreign Relations or your Carnegie Endowment or Brookings in that really we're more of an open source intelligence organization. That is, we believe very strongly in our founding DNA that in order to truly understand how these conflicts are prosecuted and the way that they are conducted, you actually need to be very deep in the data. And so we collect a tremendous amount of data every single day. We data mine exclusively from open sources, so no classified information, no secret human networks. We don't work with any partners on the ground in any countries, but we do collect extensively open source information, commercially available data, and we take all of that in, use it to create our assessments that we produce every single day.
So are you academics, military experts? What are your backgrounds?
Yeah, we're a combination of open source intelligence experts. We have military experts as well, and then we have various different areas of speciality. So our Russia team, for example, we have Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers that are area study specialists and military analysts. Within our geospatial team, we have people who know the technical sciences behind how to do geospatial analysis. Our China team has China area specialists and so on and so forth.
When did you first start tracking Ukraine?
I started working on Ukraine issues in 2014. So it's been about a decade for me now. But in 2014, I was working at the time in the U.S. legislature and the House of Representatives for a member of Congress who was on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I was actually doing a stint in Congress at the time because I thought I was interested in American domestic politics. But then Russia's actually began its war in Ukraine. They invaded eastern Ukraine. They annexed Crimea in March 2014. And there was nobody in this congressman's office who spoke Russian or spoke Ukrainian or knew anything about the region. I did. And so I was de facto the most knowledgeable person in this congressperson's office on all things Ukraine and Russia, and was field promoted to be the policy expert within that office for all things Ukraine. We worked very hard to pass some laws and bills which gave the U.S. government the legal authority to send Ukraine weapons. And since then, it's been all things Ukraine in various different capacities for the past decade.
You mentioned the wealth of information, open source information that you use to gather a picture of what's going on in Ukraine. How do you verify it?
We have a very stringent methodology that we use for cross-referencing sources, for conducting source evaluation. When we collect information, it's not just, oh, we have a tip or we have a lead. It comes from a source that we may or may not know who they are, but we have an evaluation. This person is known or unknown. They have a track record of being this accurate or this inaccurate, or they really know their stuff when they're talking about this particular subject, but they're a little bit more dodgy on this other subject. We aggregate and multi-source. We corroborate information. We always stringently look at any available visual confirmation that we can receive. So be that combat footage, be that data that we can collect from spaceborne sensors like optical imagery or radar or heat signatures. We even have the capability to collect some electronic signals information, such as radio frequency information or the location of mobile devices like cell phones. That data is commercially available and you can purchase it, and we do when we need to verify information.
And the latest reports seeming to need verification coming out of Crimea. Kyiv is saying Ukraine's SBU security service and Navy struck the Saki air base, inflicting serious damage, while the Russian military said it's destroyed 19 Ukrainian drones over Crimea in the Black Sea. What is your information gathering telling you about this?
Yeah. As of yesterday, there were at least no fewer than 15 fixed-wing Russian aircraft at the Saki Air Base. So it was a target-rich environment. Right before this interview, I checked to see what commercially available imagery there was, and the satellites have not yet made their pass over that particular area of the theater as of now. So I have no news to report to you now, but hopefully we'll get some clarity later. But we do know that the Ukrainians have been conducting a interdiction campaign in the south and against targets in Crimea. This is not new. They've been doing it now for several months, and we assess that this activity is fundamentally seeks to degrade Russian forces and positions in the south and set those conditions for more drastic Ukrainian maneuver with their counteroffensive. The Ukrainians have been diligent about striking ammunition depots, command and control bases, critical infrastructure, including air bases, and the cumulative effect of all these small little tactical missions is they degrade the Russian military's ability to conduct major operations.
And how difficult is it for you to get accurate information when it concerns a Russian-occupied area of Ukraine?
It depends. It depends. What I found difficult to verify at times have been various different Ukrainian government reports about really small niche occupation details. Like, there were a lot of reports during the horrific siege of Mariupol in early last year that the Russians had established and built crematoria in order to get rid of tremendous number of bodies, including Russian bodies, and not therefore they could claim that certain Russian soldiers were missing in action and their families would not get the remittances that they were entitled to under Russian law for combat veterans, things like that. And I tried my best to try to find some of those, and I had a hard time. You could find the mass graves. We could find the mass graves with satellite imagery. Large portions of earth were disturbed. There were footage of them being dug, taken from cell phones and people on the ground, but I couldn't find crematoria. Other activity are a lot easier to find. Everyone's seen the pictures and the videos of the fantastic Ukrainian strike against the dry docks in Sevastopol and Crimea that effectively destroyed at least one submarine and likely destroyed another naval infantry carrier. We were also able to verify a tremendous number of partisan attacks. The Ukrainians have networks on the ground in occupied Ukraine, and they do everything from helping the Ukrainian mainland military conduct fire missions by correcting artillery and gathering information on targets, to conducting assassinations. The Ukrainians, they conduct IED attacks with car bombs. They engage in targeted violence with small arms fire. They launch improvised, homemade drones that they use to strike Russian occupation officials. And a lot of that activity is actually verifiable as well.
I'm just fascinated to know. I know you gather a lot, you gather your information from open source information and you have a wealth of data. Has anyone ever actually tried to censor you, the kind of information you put out for operational security or any other reason? Have you come under pressure as an organization?
Yeah, there's been a couple concerted information campaigns that Russian actors have waged against the Institute. I have a wonderful colleague. She's our deputy team lead for our Russia team at the Institute. Her name is Katerina Stepanenko, and she is a Ukrainian American, but she was born and raised in Kiev. And there was one Russian mill blogger who created a sort of video essay expose on the Institute for the Study of War, and their whole expose was they went to our About Us page and then saw that we have some people with Ukrainian surnames and that they're Ukrainian. And then they said, oh, wow, this institute isn't entirely biased. They're pro-Ukrainian because they have Ukrainians on their staff. And that was sort of like the big expose. It didn't really do a whole lot to us, but that's happened. Beyond information operations, ever since Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine began, we've received a lot of attempts to try to phish our user accounts. We've had some attempts to try to compromise our cybersecurity, break into our emails, things like that. But we're pretty tech savvy, and we practice good digital hygiene, and so we've been able to defeat most of those attempts to break into our stuff before.
I guess you're also very careful about the kind of people that are employed.
Yes, of course, of course. We're a small organization. On our research side, we're only a couple dozen people. The Russia team that produces all the reports and 7 day a week reporting, we're only about 9 or 10 people strong. So, we select excellent people, and we're a small knit team, and we work very closely.
There's been the expectation that Ukraine will be thinking way beyond the winter into the spring to open up a new front or build on any progress that's been made. Are you seeing any indications of that planning?
I think the Ukrainians have begun very subtly messaging their intent to continue combat operations into spring 2024. And I think they want to avoid the same mistake that a lot of Western planners made over the winter 2022-2023. Recall that in September 2022, the Ukrainians conducted their spectacular Kharkiv counteroffensive, which liberated large portions of northern Ukraine in a blitz in about a week and a half. Then the Ukrainians managed to force the Russians to withdraw from Kherson in November. In December, the Ukrainians signaled their intent to continue fighting over the winter. However, the West did not provide Ukraine the sufficient quantities of equipment that it needed to continue sustaining its fight over the winter. And so the Ukrainians lost the initiative. And then in the spring, the Russians regained the initiative. They've completed the capture of Bakhmut around May. And then the Ukrainians regained the initiative when they launched their counteroffensive in the summer, in June. Ideally, I think the Ukrainians hoped they would have been able to maintain the initiative continuously and deny the ability for the Russians to be able to dictate tempo. And I think the Ukrainians, with their current counteroffensive, they seek to hold their challenge. Their main operational challenge, I think, will be to continue holding the initiative throughout the coming fall and winter months, maintain it until spring so they can continue fighting. And this will be very important because a lot of the Ukrainian progress will be for naught if the Russians manage to use the next 6 months to rest and refit and rekit and build up their forces that have been attrited. Ideally, the Ukrainians will be able to continue fixing those forces, pinning them where they are, not giving them safe haven to rest and refit and become combat effective again, so that the Ukrainians can continue exploiting that throughout the spring. And the key thing about the weather and the tempo is that we all know that the Ukrainians' ability to conduct major mechanized operations is impacted by how wet the ground is. We expect there to be fall rains in October and November, but if we are given a very dry winter or a dry fall, which happens, you have sometimes abnormally dry seasons, then it can protract the time window through which the Ukrainians can continue operations. Also, for what it's worth, the Ukrainians primarily for the last 3 months have been mostly conducting dismounted infantry assaults as they needle their way through the field fortifications, and they've relied less on major mechanized operations. If it's muddy, the Ukrainians can continue conducting dismounted infantry operations. The whole sort of rule about you can't conduct mechanized operations in mud, that's true for mechanized operations, which have not been the primary mode of this Ukrainian counteroffensive. So I think the Ukrainians seek to sustain their fight, and that'll be their key operational challenge for the next 6 months.
It sounds like you've got pressing work to get on with. I'm just wondering, just finally, what you got for the rest of the day. What's ahead of you?
Got the report for today. I'll be working on that. Have a series of reports I have to read, and then I'll be digging down into a long form report that I've been writing, which is actually separate from the daily updates. I'm writing a long form report on a parallel and much more successful Kremlin campaign to de facto annex Belarus through political, economic, and military integration through this super national structure that they've created called the Union State. That's been a long-standing Kremlin campaign. It's been a lot more effective, and the Kremlin has a strategy to try to accomplish its de facto annexation of Belarus by 2030. This is a paper I've been working on for a couple of years, and I'm finally hoping to close
George,
the loop on it.
When you finish that paper, will you come and talk to us about it?
I'd be very happy to. Yeah.
Great to talk to you. So thank you so much for your time today, George Barros. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.